Before we start, let me ask you something. If you were captured in 1944 as a German soldier and sent to a prison camp in the middle of Texas, what would you expect? Beatings? Interrogations? Starvation? Brutality? That's what they expected too. But what they found instead was something so unbelievable that decades later, historians still argue about it. And the strangest part? The prisoners didn't want to escape, even though they could. The transfer. In late 1944, after the Allied push through France, hundreds of German POWs were transported across the Atlantic. Many were told they were going to labor camps. Some believed they'd be interrogated for military intelligence. One transport group was sent deep into central Texas, near the small town of Hearne. The facility was officially known as Camp Hearne. The men braced for the worst. They stepped off the train in chains. What they saw confused them immediately. No screaming guards, no watchtowers with machine guns pointed at them. Yes, there was fencing, but no electrified wire, no visible brutality. The guards looked relaxed, too relaxed. The first shock. The first surprise came at dinner. The POWs were handed trays loaded with fresh bread, meat, vegetables, coffee. One of the German corporals reportedly whispered, "This must be for the officers." It wasn't. It was for everyone. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States was required to feed POWs the same rations as its own soldiers. And in 1944 America? That meant abundance. Several prisoners later admitted something shocking. They were eating better in Texas than their families were eating back in Germany. The second shock. The barracks were clean. Each prisoner had a proper bed, sheets, blankets, heating. Access to showers. They were given access to sports fields. They could play soccer. They could attend church services. They could even join music groups. Within months, the camp had a bakery, a small theater group, a woodworking shop, a camp newspaper written in German. Let that sink in. A prison camp with a newspaper. The guards' problem, here's where things became strange. The American guards stationed at Camp Hearne were often older reservists, men unfit for overseas combat. Their pay was modest. Their food rations were strictly military standard. And sometimes, the POWs had access to better ingredients through camp labor programs. Locals began noticing something uncomfortable. The prisoners looked healthier than the guards. This created quiet tension. But that still wasn't the strangest part. The open secret. Technically, the camp had fences, but Texas is vast, flat, open, and brutally hot. Beyond the fencing stretched miles of ranch land, dry fields, and highways where everyone knew everyone. If a German soldier escaped, where would he go? He didn't speak English well. He had no money usable outside camp-issued coupons. He stood out immediately. And then there was the heat. Texas summers were punishing. Several POWs admitted later, the environment itself was a stronger barrier than the guards. But one incident changed everything. The escape that proved a point. In early 1945, two young German soldiers decided to test the system. They slipped under a maintenance section of fence during a storm. No alarms, no gunfire. They made it nearly 5 miles before collapsing from dehydration and disorientation. And here's the unbelievable part. A local Texas farmer found them wandering near his property. He didn't attack them. He didn't panic. He drove them back to the camp. And the guards didn't beat them, didn't throw them in isolation for months. They restricted privileges briefly. Then life resumed normally. The message became clear. Escape wasn't terrifying. It was pointless. The real twist. By mid-1945, something unexpected began happening inside Camp Herne. Political divisions formed among the German prisoners. Hardline Nazi loyalists began trying to enforce ideology inside the camp, intimidating anti-Nazi prisoners. They held secret meetings. They spread propaganda. They threatened fellow POWs. And here's the twist. The American administration did something no one expected. Instead of cracking down brutally, they allowed controlled self-governance among prisoners. Democratic voting systems were introduced inside barracks. Anti-Nazi prisoners were quietly supported. Gradually, ideological control shifted. Inside a POW camp in Texas, German soldiers were participating in democratic processes for the first time. For many, it was their first real exposure to functioning democracy, and it deeply unsettled some of them, because it worked. The thing that made it impossible to leave. But here is the part most people don't believe. Near the end of the war, rumors spread that Germany was collapsing. Cities destroyed, industry shattered, food scarce. Letters from home confirmed it. Meanwhile, in Texas, 3 meals a day, medical care, clean beds, no bombing, no fear of secret police. Returning home no longer meant honor. It meant ruin. When Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, celebrations broke out in American cities. Inside Camp Herne? Silence. Because the prisoners knew something the public didn't consider. Going home might be worse than staying. Several POWs reportedly asked camp officials a quiet question. Is there a way to remain in America? And that was the unspoken feature of the camp. It wasn't just a prison, it was a waiting room. Many former POWs later immigrated legally to the United States. Some settled in Texas, some married locally, some never returned to Germany at all. Why this story feels unreal. We imagine prison camps as places of constant brutality, but places like Camp Herne challenge that assumption. It was still captivity, still barbed wire, still loss of freedom. But it also became something else, a strange social experiment in the middle of Texas, where enemy soldiers ate well, slept safely, played soccer, learned democracy, and sometimes realized the world they were taught to hate wasn't what they were told. If you think Camp Herne was just a comfortable wartime anomaly, this is where the story turns. Because the greatest danger inside the camp didn't come from the American guards. It came from the prisoners themselves. A camp divided. By early 1945, Camp Herne held hundreds of German POWs from different units and backgrounds. They weren't all the same. Some were hardened Nazi loyalists, young conscripts who had barely finished school, career soldiers, former students, bakers, mechanics. And here was the problem. The war might have been ending outside the fences, but inside the camp, it was still ideological. Hardline Nazi prisoners began organizing quietly. They held secret discussion groups. They enforced strict loyalty to Hitler. They labeled other prisoners as traitors for speaking positively about America. Anyone who attended English classes too enthusiastically. Anyone who expressed doubt about the Reich. Anyone who cooperated openly with camp programs was watched, intimidated, sometimes beaten. The prisoner who spoke too freely. One prisoner, we'll call him Karl for simplicity, began openly criticizing Nazi leadership inside the barracks. He had received letters from home describing destroyed cities, starving civilians, and the lies of propaganda. Karl said something that, in that environment, was explosive. Germany was misled. We were misled. He attended democratic discussion groups organized within the camp. He volunteered for translation assistance. He openly said the war was lost long before Berlin fell. To the hardliners, that made him dangerous. Not because he could escape, but because he could influence others. Camp self-governance. The American administration at Camp Hearn had implemented a limited prisoner self-governance structure. Barracks elected spokesmen. Committees managed internal disputes. Work details were coordinated with prisoner leadership. The goal was stability. But this also gave dominant factions power. And in some barracks, the most aggressive Nazi loyalists won those positions, which meant they could quietly control food assignments, social circles, and internal pressure. The Americans monitored things, but they didn't understand how deep ideological loyalty still ran. The night everything changed. One humid Texas evening in mid-1945, after Germany had already surrendered in Europe, Karl was found dead in a storage area near his barracks. No gunshots, no guards involved. He had been beaten by fellow prisoners. The official story inside the camp was that it had been a fight, but everyone knew what it really was. Punishment. A warning. Even in a camp with decent food and warm beds, ideology still had teeth. The American response. The murder shocked camp authorities. They had believed that better treatment would reduce extremism, and in many cases, it had. But this proved something else. Comfort doesn't erase belief overnight. An investigation followed. Multiple prisoners were questioned, and several were eventually tried in U.S. military court for the killing. That trial sent a powerful signal. Inside this camp, the Geneva Convention protected prisoners from abuse by guards, but it did not protect them from consequences of their own violence. For many moderate prisoners, that moment shifted something. Because they saw something unfamiliar. Rule of law applied evenly, even to enemy soldiers. The psychological shift. After the trial, internal dynamics began changing. The hardliners lost credibility. The war was over. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed. And now, even inside a prison camp thousands of miles from Europe, violence in its name led only to punishment. More prisoners began attending English classes. More joined skill workshops. Some started planning for life after repatriation. And quietly, something uncomfortable dawned on many of them. The enemy they were taught to fear had given them fair trials, due process, food security, stability. Meanwhile, the regime they had served ended in rubble. That realization spread slowly, but it spread. The unspoken fear. By late 1945, repatriation discussions began. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure barely functioning. Letters from home described hunger, winters, and chaos. And so the strangest tension emerged inside Camp Hearn. Men who once dreamed of escaping, now dreaded being sent back. Because outside the fences of this Texas camp was freedom. But across the Atlantic was uncertainty. Some prisoners even delayed paperwork. Others inquired about agricultural labor visas. A few openly asked American officers, "What happens if we don't want to go back?" The guards didn't always have answers. By late 1945, the war was over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. Europe was in ruins. But in Texas, at Camp Hearn, something unexpected was happening. The prisoners weren't preparing for punishment. They were preparing for work, and eventually, for town visits. The labor program no one expected. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be assigned non-combat labor. In Texas, that meant farms, cotton fields, peanut farms, corn harvesting, railroad maintenance. And here was the reality in 1945. America had a labor shortage. Millions of American men were still overseas. Farmers needed help. So German POWs were transported daily under supervision to nearby agricultural sites. At first, locals were furious. Newspapers printed headlines questioning why enemy soldiers were working American land. Some families had sons fighting in Europe just months earlier. Tension was real. But then, something strange happened. The first conversations. The prisoners worked hard, very hard, not out of patriotism, not out of love for America. But because camp privileges depended on good performance, farmers began noticing. They were disciplined, skilled, respectful. Many had grown up in rural Germany and understood agriculture well. Some could repair machinery. Some were trained mechanics. Some even had engineering backgrounds. One Texas farmer reportedly said, "They're not what I expected." That sentence would repeat itself many times. The day the fence didn't matter. On certain work assignments, guards were minimal, sometimes just one armed supervisor for dozens of POWs. Technically, escape was possible. Realistically, still unlikely. The Texas landscape was vast. The towns were tight-knit. German accents stood out immediately. But what changed everything wasn't geography. It was interaction. Prisoners began talking to civilians, carefully at first. Broken English, hand gestures, shared tools, and gradually, humanization. Church, music, and small-town Texas. In some cases, local churches requested permission for POW choirs to perform hymns. Yes, German prisoners singing in Texas churches. It sounds unbelievable, but documentation shows that similar programs happened across multiple U.S. camps during the war. In Hearn, small community events sometimes included supervised attendance by selected POWs with good behavior records. The optics were strange. Former enemy soldiers sitting quietly in pews, children staring at them, mothers unsure how to feel. But then the music would start, and for a moment, the war felt distant. The letters that changed everything. Meanwhile, letters from Germany grew more desperate. Cities destroyed, food rationing severe, housing shortages everywhere. Some POWs learned their homes no longer existed. Some discovered family members were missing. The idea of going home no longer meant returning to normal life. It meant entering chaos. And Texas had food, jobs, open land, stability. For the first time, a few prisoners began asking local farmers questions that weren't about work. How much land does this farm have? What does it cost to live here? Could someone stay? The quiet attachments. It didn't happen often, but it happened enough to matter. Some POWs formed genuine friendships with local families, shared meals after work shifts, conversations about rebuilding Germany, discussions about politics, regret, and the future. A few young prisoners admitted privately that they feared returning to a divided Germany far more than they feared remaining in America. And here was the uncomfortable truth. Some local Texans felt the same way. They saw young men, many barely in their 20s, who had been pulled into a war machine larger than themselves. Not all were ideological. Not all were extremists. Some were simply exhausted. The legal wall. Despite these connections, repatriation policy was clear. After processing, POWs would be returned to Germany. No exceptions, at least officially. But the process was slow. Ships were limited. Europe was unstable. Logistics were complicated, which meant months more in Texas. Months where fences felt less like barriers and more like technicalities. The hard question. One evening in early 1946, during a supervised farm assignment, a POW reportedly asked a guard, "If you were me, would you go back?" The guard didn't answer immediately, because it wasn't a simple question. Go back to what? A destroyed nation? A shattered economy? Political uncertainty? Or remain in a country that had once been your enemy, but now offered opportunity? That question lingered in the air long after the workday ended. The emotional shift. By the time repatriation began in earnest, something almost unimaginable had occurred. Some prisoners didn't celebrate departure. They hesitated. They delayed packing. They took long looks at Texas fields, not because they forgot they were prisoners, but because the camp had become predictable. And predictability is powerful after years of war. When repatriation finally began in 1946, the mood inside Camp Hearn wasn't what you'd expect. There were no cheers, no celebrations, no dramatic scenes of men rushing toward freedom. Instead, there was silence. Because freedom meant something very different now. The journey back. Transport ships carried former POWs across the Atlantic to a Germany that barely resembled the country they had left. Major cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were shattered landscapes of rubble. Rail systems were barely functional. Food shortages were severe. Housing was scarce. Many returning soldiers discovered their homes were destroyed, their families displaced, their towns divided between occupation zones. The psychological shock was enormous. In Texas, they had experienced stability, routine, and regular meals. In Germany, they found uncertainty, the hardest realization. Several former POWs later described the same feeling upon arrival. We left prison and returned to chaos. It wasn't that Germany lacked dignity. It lacked infrastructure. In some regions, daily caloric intake dropped dangerously low during the harsh winters that followed the war. Meanwhile, memories of Texas lingered. Warm barracks, organized schedules, working farms, predictable days, and most importantly, opportunity. Letters across the ocean. Within a year, something unexpected began happening. Letters started traveling back across the Atlantic. Former prisoners wrote to Texas farmers they had worked for, guards they had spoken with, families they had met during supervised labor programs. The tone of the letters was striking. They weren't angry. They weren't resentful. Many expressed gratitude. Some asked about job opportunities. Some inquired about immigration pathways. At first, the responses were cautious. But America in the late 1940s was entering a period of economic expansion. Labor was needed again. And for some Texans, these former POWs were no longer the enemy. They were Hans, or Karl, or Dieter, men they had worked alongside. The legal return immigration wasn't simple. Background checks were required. Sponsorship was necessary. Paperwork was slow. But it was possible. And slowly, over several years, some former German POWs returned to the United States, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. Some settled in Texas, others moved to the Midwest. A few pursued engineering or agricultural careers, Imagine that transformation, from captured enemy soldier to farm laborer behind barbed wire, to legal American resident. It sounds fictional, but it happened. The most unbelievable conversations. When a few of these former POWs revisited Texas towns, the reactions were mixed. Some locals welcomed them. Others were uneasy. After all, just a few years earlier, American families had sent sons overseas to fight the same uniforms these men once wore. But time changes perspective, and the war had ended. What remained were individuals, not armies. One former prisoner reportedly said during a return visit, "I was treated like a human being here. I want to live where that is normal." That sentence carries weight, because it hints at the deeper impact of the camp. The unexpected outcome. The original purpose of POW camps was containment, temporary detention until war's end. But in places like Camp Hearn, something more complex occurred. Exposure to democracy, to civilian life, to ordinary Americans. For some prisoners, it dismantled rigid ideology. For others, it planted curiosity. And for a small number, it changed the trajectory of their lives entirely. The irony. Think about the irony for a moment. Thousands of miles from Europe, in the middle of Texas, inside a fenced compound built for wartime detention, some German soldiers experienced their first democratic vote within camp governance, their first fair trial observation, their first sustained exposure to American civil society. Not in a university, not in a diplomatic exchange, but in a POW camp. Here's the uncomfortable question. Was Camp Hearn just a humane POW facility, or was it something more strategic? Because when historians began re-examining records from Camp Hearn, they noticed a pattern. The camp didn't just hold prisoners, it observed them, carefully. The bigger picture. During World War II, the United States held over 370,000 German POWs across multiple camps. Many were located in rural states: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arizona. The official explanation was logistical: space, distance from coastlines, available land. But inside several camps, including Hearn, programs went beyond basic detention. There were structured educational classes, English lessons, political discussion groups, access to American newspapers, encouragement of internal elections among prisoners. This wasn't required for basic imprisonment. It was intentional. The soft power strategy. By 1944, American officials understood something important. Eventually, Germany would need to be rebuilt. And rebuilding required people. Engineers, teachers, administrators, farmers. If returning POWs carried only resentment, rebuilding would be harder. But if some returned with a more nuanced view of democracy, that could shape post-war Europe in subtle ways. No official document labeled Camp Hearn as a re-education experiment. But similar programs in other camps were openly designed to expose prisoners to democratic systems, not through force, through experience. Why comfort was strategic. Brutality creates martyrs. Martyrs strengthen extremist narratives. But dignity? Dignity creates doubt. When a prisoner expects cruelty and instead receives fairness, something shifts internally. Not immediately, not universally, but gradually. Inside Camp Hearn, hardline Nazi influence weakened over time, especially after Germany's surrender. Why? Because the reality around them contradicted the propaganda they had grown up with. They were told Americans were barbaric. Yet guards enforced due process. They were told democracy was weak. Yet camp governance functioned smoothly. They were told enemies were immoral, yet they were treated according to international law. That cognitive dissonance matters. The psychological mechanism. There's a powerful human instinct at play here. When someone treats you with unexpected fairness, your mind searches for explanation. Either the kindness is fake, or your previous beliefs were incomplete. Over months, sometimes years, belief systems can erode quietly, not through debate, through lived contradiction. That's what made camps like Herne so unusual. They didn't argue ideology aggressively. They modeled an alternative. But it wasn't perfect. We need to be clear. Camp Herne was still a prison. There were fences. There were armed guards. There were restrictions on movement. There was forced repatriation. And as we discussed in Part 2, extremist violence still occurred inside the camp. Comfort didn't erase belief overnight. But compared to the devastation awaiting many prisoners in Europe, Texas felt structured and stable. And structure influences psychology. The long-term ripple effect. After the war, West Germany underwent rapid democratization. Of course, that transformation had many causes. Allied occupation policies, economic recovery plans, political leadership changes, the division between East and West. But among the millions rebuilding post-war Germany were thousands of former POWs who had spent years inside American camps. Some historians argue that exposure to democratic systems during captivity may have quietly accelerated post-war adaptation, not because prisoners were brainwashed, but because they had already seen an alternative model function. And that matters. The question that makes this story so fascinating. Imagine two scenarios. Scenario A, brutal imprisonment, beatings, starvation, humiliation. Scenario B, order, food, fair treatment, limited self-governance. Which one is more likely to create lifelong hatred? Which one is more likely to create reflection? Camp Herne leaned heavily toward Scenario B, and that's what makes this story feel almost backwards compared to what we expect from wartime narratives. The final irony emerging. By the late 1940s, some former POWs who had once stood behind barbed wire in Texas were contributing to rebuilding a democratic West Germany. Some had immigrated to the U.S., some became engineers, teachers, farmers, and the strange truth remains. For a brief period in the middle of World War II, a prison camp in Texas became a crossroads where ideology met lived reality, and reality proved stronger than propaganda, at least for some. When people hear POW camp, they imagine tunnels, cut fences, midnight dashes under gunfire. But the records connected to Camp Herne tell a different story. The number of serious escape attempts? Shockingly low. And the success rate? Even lower. But here's what makes it strange. It wasn't because security was extreme. It was because escape didn't make sense. The geography trap. Look at a map of central Texas. Wide-open farmland. Long highways. Small towns where strangers are noticed instantly. If a German POW escaped in 1945, he faced several immediate problems. Heavy accent, no civilian clothes, no valid American currency, no transportation, limited understanding of the terrain. And unlike Europe, there were no friendly borders nearby. Mexico was hundreds of miles away. The Gulf Coast? Even farther. On foot, under the Texas sun, survival alone was a challenge. In many ways, the environment was the real fence. The statistics that surprise historians. Across the United States, thousands of German POWs attempted escape during the war. but most were recaptured quickly. In camps like Herne, escapes were usually short-lived. A few men slipped away. Most were found wandering within days. Some were returned by civilians. And here's the part that feels almost unbelievable. In several cases across Texas camps, locals reported escaped POWs voluntarily approaching farms asking for water, not hiding. They weren't trying to build underground resistance. They were dehydrated, lost, and quickly realizing the plan was flawed. The real barrier was psychological. But geography alone doesn't explain the low numbers, because, technically, some prisoners had opportunities. Work details outside fences, minimal guard supervision, stormy nights, yet large-scale escape attempts never materialized. Why? Because by 1945, many prisoners were doing the math. If they escaped successfully, what then? Return to Germany during collapse? Hide indefinitely in a foreign country? Survive without documentation? Inside the camp, food was guaranteed. Medical care was available. War was over. Violence was minimal. Outside, uncertainty. The cost-benefit calculation shifted. Escape stopped being heroic. It became irrational. The story of the almost escape. One former POW later described standing near the outer fencing during a work detail. No guard in direct sight. Tools in hand. Open field ahead. He could have run. Instead, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, he realized something disturbing. He didn't want to run. Not because he loved captivity, but because he trusted the system more than the unknown. That moment says more about the camp than any statistic. The one thing that made it impossible to leave, it wasn't the fence, it wasn't the guards, it wasn't the threat of punishment, it was predictability. After years of global chaos, predictability is powerful. 3 meals a day, clear rules, no bombs, no front lines, no sudden transfers to eastern battlefields. For men who had survived Stalingrad, Normandy, or relentless bombing campaigns, that stability was almost addictive. Freedom sounds appealing, until freedom means instability. The reputation that spread. By the final months before repatriation, escape wasn't the dominant conversation. The dominant conversation was, what will Germany be like? Letters described rubble. Division between Soviet and Western zones. Food shortages. Political purges. Inside the camp, they had structure. Outside, they faced rebuilding from zero. The irony became clear. The prison camp was the most stable place many of them had experienced in years. The quiet acceptance. So escape attempts dwindled. Not because prisoners were broken, not because they were threatened, but because the war had shifted the definition of home. And when repatriation ships were scheduled, many boarded not with excitement, but with anxiety. Years passed. The fences of Camp Herne were dismantled. The barracks were eventually removed. The war became history. Germany rebuilt. America moved forward. The world changed. But the men who once lived behind those Texas fences carried the memory with them for decades. And when some of them were interviewed later in life, their reflections were complicated. It was the safest place I saw during the war. That sentence appears in more than one oral history from former German POWs held in the United States. Think about that. Not the battlefield, not their hometown, not even post-war Europe. A prison camp in Texas. Safe. For men who had survived artillery bombardments, urban warfare, aerial bombings, and collapsing front lines, Camp Hearn represented something they hadn't felt in years. Stability, no sudden shelling, no freezing trenches, no desperate retreats, just routine. And routine can feel like relief when the alternative is chaos. The emotional conflict. But memory is rarely simple. Some former POWs admitted feeling guilt for remembering the camp in a positive light. After all, they had been soldiers for a regime responsible for immense destruction. Their country had suffered devastating consequences. Millions across Europe endured horrors far beyond captivity in Texas. So how do you reconcile that? How do you admit that one of the calmest periods of your wartime life happened behind enemy fences? That contradiction stayed with many of them. The ones who came back. A small number of former POWs eventually immigrated to the United States. Some returned specifically to Texas. They married, started farms, opened businesses, raised families. Imagine explaining that story to your grandchildren. I once stood behind barbed wire in this state as a prisoner of war. And then, I chose to return. That transformation feels almost cinematic. But it happened. What Camp Hearn represents today. Today, the site of Camp Hearn is remembered through historical markers and preservation efforts. It stands as a reminder of a lesser-known chapter of World War II history. That on American soil, enemy soldiers were detained not in secret torture camps, but in facilities that, while restrictive, largely followed international law. It challenges assumptions, it complicates narratives, it forces us to examine something uncomfortable. Sometimes the most powerful influence isn't force, it's contrast. The final question. So what made it impossible to leave? It wasn't the fence, it wasn't the guards, it wasn't even the Texas heat. It was this. Inside the camp, life was predictable, structured, human. Outside the camp, the world was uncertain, ruined, divided. When the war ended, many prisoners faced a paradox. Freedom meant instability, captivity meant safety, and that psychological reversal is what makes this story so unforgettable. The legacy camp. Hearn was not perfect. It was not paradise. It was still a prison. But it reveals a powerful historical lesson. Treatment matters. Not because it erases conflict, not because it guarantees transformation, but because it shapes what comes after. Some of the men who once stood inside that Texas camp went on to help rebuild a democratic Germany. Some helped build lives in America. And decades later, when asked about their time there, many did not speak with bitterness. They spoke with reflection, and sometimes, quietly, with gratitude. If this story surprised you, that's the point. History is rarely simple, and sometimes the most unexpected chapters are the ones that challenge everything we think we know.